The President has received the following letter from Senator Moore. Pursuant to Standing Order 75, I propose that the following matter of public importance be submitted to the Senate for discussion. The Abbott government's shameful attempt to hold the jobs of 1,700 scientists and the future of Australian research hostage in pursuit of university fee deregulation. Is the proposal supported? The proposal is supported. I understand that informal arrangements have been made to allocate specific times to each of the speakers in today's debate. With the concurrence of the Senate, I shall ask the clerks to set the clock accordingly. Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Well, what have we seen today but yet another backflip by the Abbott government? And to us on this side, it just demonstrates the internal dissent within the Abbott government, the instability of the Prime Minister, concerned with one thing, and that is clinging to the power, clinging to his job as the Prime Minister. And the losers for all this internal dissent, this ongoing backflipping which is absolutely being played out between the would-be Prime Minister Turnbull and the actual Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, are hurting ordinary Australians. They are hurting the Australian public with this continual backflipping of not knowing if something's going to go ahead or not going ahead. And at the moment, that indecision is being thrust at the many Australian university students, still facing well into the 2015 semester the threat of $100,000 degrees. And universities, despite Mr Pyne saying the 20%'s off the table at the moment, he still intends to go ahead with it. Now, where have we heard that before? Oh, I remember, it was the GP tax, when suddenly we saw a bit of a backflip before Christmas and then we saw another backflip. But what do we hear from the Abbott government, Mr Acting Deputy President? We hear they still want to go ahead with the GP tax. It's still there on the table. They've just got to find some sneaky, manipulative way to get it through the parliament. And it's exactly the same with the 20% cut. Minister Pyne is saying he still wants to pursue that 20% cut. He's just got to find that sneaky, manipulative way to get it through the Senate. And now last week we had scientists being held to ransom. What a despicable thing to do, to try and threaten and blackmail 1,700 scientific jobs in this country because the Prime Minister and Minister Pyne couldn't get their way because of the dissent in the Abbott government about not being quite sure what it is they're doing. And that was played out last week at a Senate inquiry we had into higher education, where we had those scientists from NCRIS appearing before the Senate. And I've got to say, I felt quite sick in the stomach to hear that people had already left their job. Australia has already lost some scientists because of the indecision and the internal dissent of the Abbott government. Some have already gone. And we heard Senator Mackenzie say to Mrs Rose Hicks, the Australian National Fabrication Facility CEO, and I quote, "What was your reaction when the current government, managed to find the $150 million to keep NCRIS going while a review of infrastructure was commenced?" She, Mrs Hicks, replied that it was absolutely critical, something Labor's been saying. We recognised that the funding was critical because we had funding there. But she went on to say it hadn't been released. And I don't know which planet Senator Mackenzie has been on, but she seemed a bit surprised by that. But she says, but they, meaning the government, had found the savings. But Mrs Hicks went on to say, but it hasn't been released. There was an announcement made in May, but the funds have never flowed. And Senator Mackenzie said, oh, well, that's because we had to find this $150 million. It was contingent upon the government getting its higher education reform package passing. Senator Carr interjected and asked why that's so, and certainly Mrs Hicks said that was not her understanding at the time. And what do we have today? We have this complete backflip from Senator Pyne, who finally, from Minister Pyne, who finally admits that yes, the two were not related. The higher education reforms and the taking away of funding for 1,700 science jobs were not related. It was just a threat. It was to try and put some pressure here on the Senate to say to the Senate and to the Labor Party and others who are opposed to this bill, if you keep your opposition up, then 1,700 scientists will lose their jobs. Well, we've found again today that is simply not true. It is simply not true. It's another con job by the Abbott government, another con job to try and hoodwink the Australian people. Well, they're not fooled. They are not fooled. But the damage has already been done, because we heard very clearly at that Senate inquiry on Friday that some scientists have already left their jobs, and some of the programs which were in place have been wound down. I cannot believe that the Abbott government would stoop to playing politics at such a level to try and make Australia into some kind of place where scientific endeavour is not pursued with absolute vigour. Who would do that? Only a government on its knees, only a government desperate, only a government that's full of internal dissent would play those sorts of tricks on the scientific community in Australia. Because we've been funding science in this country for a very long time, and all we've heard from the government is backflips and misinformation. Minister Pyne tried to claim that Labor didn't have any money in the kitty for this, and that's completely untrue. And Minister Pyne claimed last week that NCRIS funding was part of the reform bill. Well, either it is or it isn't. And Labor was saying all along it was never part of the reform bill. Well, guess what? Today, the minister in charge, the supposedly adult government in charge, admits, yes, that's correct, it's not part of the reform bill, and we see this backflipping. Now, of course, we're really happy about that. We're very happy. The truth is finally out there that this funding for NCRIS is not in any way connected to the higher ed reform bill. But that does not detract from the harm the Abbott government has done already to Australia's scientific community. And I hope they are ashamed of their actions, because they should be ashamed of what they have done to science in this country. To make it a political football in the way that they have done is an absolute disgrace. And then to try and deny that, to try and say that the higher ed reform bill and the NCRES funding were somehow absolutely linked. And to give people such heartache over 1,700 scientific jobs, when we've had, since 2004, over $2 billion worth of funding to NCRES, and over 35,000 Australians and international researchers use NCRES facilities. 27 national facility employers employing those 1,700 highly skilled scientists. And all of that, the Abbott government put at risk. All of that they put at risk because they want to play political games, because their government is in such disarray, because there's a squabble over who wants to be Prime Minister, and we are seeing this being played out over and over again. These disgraceful backflips risking Australia's international reputation when it comes to science, risking 1,700 jobs. And very clearly we heard at the Senate inquiry on Friday that some have already left. So we have already had a brain drain because of this disgraceful coupling, this completely untruthful coupling of the higher ed bill with the NCRES funding. And the Abbott government needs to be held accountable to that, and certainly Labor will hold them accountable. You know, the threat made to Australian scientists will not be forgotten. To make a political football out of a community that's normally immune to this, that gets on and does their job and does valuable research for Australia, that upholds our international reputation. We heard on Friday scientists telling us that they would have to go offshore. And what the Abbott government now has done to this community of scientists is to put doubt in their minds. Who's to say that Minister Pyne won't turn around next week and make some other pronouncement? Because the Abbott government simply can't be trusted when it comes to higher education. It can't be trusted when it comes to health. It can't be trusted when it comes to any part of life that makes Australia work. And we've seen nothing but broken promises from this government. And now we have the scientific community having to watch their backs, having to look at where their funding comes from, having absolutely no commitment from the Abbott government about science. I mean, perhaps that's why they didn't have a science minister. Perhaps this is what they planned all along. And it shows, again, their total disregard for our scientific community, the fact there's no minister there, that they can just be pulled along and pushed here and pushed there for the political will of the Abbott government, for a Prime Minister so desperate to hold on to his job that he wants to threaten
Senator
scientists.
Lyons, your time